Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is Wednesday today, September 18th, and I'm sitting down to make a video on Saturn returns. I'm doing this by popular demand because I did a video yesterday on Saturn stationing, and I got like 10 emails from people being like, will you please do something on Saturn returns? And I was like, all right. So this is a short one. We're going to call this part one because that'll give me a chance to make some more interesting content around this topic because it is a really popular topic. Interestingly, it's not something I've ever spoken about on my YouTube channel before. So I figure I'll call this part one and then do like a part two and part three later when I get time. So the part one, I want to say just a few basic things that can help you understand a Saturn return, whether it is your first Saturn return, your second Saturn return. If you're living to a third Saturn return, fine, even your third, right? That would put us around 90. So first of all, this is not going to be like a hyper technical talk. I'm just doing this basically almost like a Q&A episode. So Saturn returns mean Saturn is returning to the place that Saturn was located when you were born in the zodiac. So, for example, if you were born with Saturn at 5 degrees of Taurus, when Saturn goes all the way around the sun after you were born relative to where it was located at 5 Taurus and returns back to 5 Taurus going all the way through the zodiac, that's a Saturn return. Now, Saturn returns typically happen between 27 and 30. And I give it a broad range because there's, Saturn's cycle is such that you're getting close to 29 and a half years as a more precise moment of a Saturn return. But as soon as Saturn enters into the sign in which Saturn was located when you were born, that's actually the start of your Saturn return. So for anybody right now who has Saturn at any degree of Capricorn, the Saturn return begins when Saturn enters Capricorn. It ends when Saturn leaves Capricorn. So the first way of measuring a Saturn return is by the planet Saturn entering the same sign it was at when you were born, which can happen fairly early because Saturn spends, between 2 and 3 years in each sign. It can fall roughly between, let's say, 27 to 27 and a half years old, all the way up to 29 and a half, 30 years old, like right around there. So, so that's the basic definition astrologically. Look at Saturn in your chart, see where it's located. If you're tracking the planets, when Saturn comes back around to that point around, let's say technically between 29 and 30, but anywhere between like 27 and a half to 30 years old, right around there. That's your Saturn return. Saturn returns are not like a major feature of ancient astrological texts, right? It's not like every text is saying now when your Saturn return happens, right? But it is, of course, it is a major cycle. Anytime a planet returns to the place it was when you were born, and the longer the planet takes to get back to that place, the more momentum is behind it. And it represents a seeding moment. Anytime that Saturn returns to Saturn, for example, and conjoins its own natal position, it's the seeding of a new cycle. What kind of new cycle? Well, in order to understand what a Saturn return means and what the start of a new Saturn cycle implies at your Saturn return around 30 years old, again, between 57 and 60, right around there, those moments are, in order to understand what they mean, you have to have a deeper understanding of Saturn. But you can start with some really simple things. The deeper understanding of Saturn is always going to involve, by the way, the total context of Saturn in the natal chart. Is it a daytime or nighttime chart? That means Saturn's going to be in sect or out of sect. Is Saturn well dignified, or is it peregrine? If it's peregrine, or if it's not in one of its own signs or its exaltation, then what is its relationship with its host planet like? Does it have a trine or a sextile, a square, an opposition, no line of sight whatsoever? Is it conjoined? These kinds of things really matter. What house is it in? Is it angular? Is it cadent? Is it succedent? So there's a lot that goes into it, right? Does it have aspects from benefics? That can be helpful. Does it have a hard aspect with Mars? That's also telling. So once you get a feel for what the individual Saturn is like in the birth chart, then you can get like an astrologer to read it in a more deep, accurate, meaningful way. But a lot of people don't have that option. So we're reading it for ourselves, right? And when you're reading it for yourself, you just want to know, like, what's the gist of what should I expect? What's the gist of this between, like, 27 and 30 years old, or my late 50s closing in on 60. Saturn's major function, in one of the simplest words associated with Saturn, is the word no. And on the surface, this word can sound like a real bummer, especially when we're younger. One of the features of youth is that we like to have all of the possibilities available to us at all times. This is youth. Having all of the available possibilities is the same thing as imagining a future that's wide open. And the optimism associated with this is Jupiterian. It's very optimistic, it's bright, it's possible, it's abundant. Jupiter, not surprisingly, has long been associated seasonally with springtime and youth. Whereas Saturn is associated with old age and winter and with the negating qualities of life. No, that won't work. You can't do all of the things. You can't have all of the things. Not only that, but it turns out that the things that we do get, for example, let's say that you get a car. You're 16, amazing. What's that song by Tom Cochrane, who I believe was actually, I think Tom Cochrane was actually a porn star. But Tom Cochrane was Life is a Highway, right? I think I'm not kidding about that either. I think he actually became a porn star at some point. I seem to remember that from like a VH1 pop-up video or something like that. Anyway, life is a highway. You've got your huge sunglasses on, you've got your first car, everything is possible. Jupiter. But then as life goes on, suddenly you realize you've got to pay the insurance, which means you've got to work a job, which means you've got to get up in the morning, which means you've got to put up with coworkers. That's Saturn. No. Maintenance, if you want something nice, you have to maintain it. And the maintenance of something nice is painful. Marriage. Great. Sounds wonderful. In the springtime of our youth, we're all Romeo and Juliets. But then all of a sudden, just like the story of Romeo and Juliet ends in youthful tragedy, we come to realize that marriage requires a lot of hard work and sacrifice and compromise. And I like to tell people that if you are someone who has any curiosity and tolerance and interest in pain, if you're a romantic, in other words, if you have a taste for Saturn, then marriage is awesome. Because that when something fails, when something doesn't work, when there's a no, you learn something by means, some things become more defined, more refined, more adult, more real, when you have to wake up to them not being what you thought they were, or to something being difficult, or to someone not being everything you thought they were going to be, someone not being able to change, right? That, like, it's not subjectively fun to encounter that kind of hardship that comes with the car, the maintenance of the car, the day job, all of that work. But again, if you have any tolerance for pain, if you have any love of winter, then these losses become the means by which we start to create soul. The spirit of spring and the spirit of youth, in a sense, the spirit of Jupiter, is driven by possibility, life, and what are we here to live for? When Saturn comes along, Saturn starts thinking, how do I want to die? Saturn starts living life from the perspective of the eventuality, the inescapable eventuality of death. And in that sense, Saturn is sometimes the cold water on the early winter morning that's getting splashed over our head that just sucks. But Saturn, again, is also, where there's tragedy, where there's loss, where there's work, where there are these darker, more melancholic qualities, there's also a clearer sense of who we are and what we're dealing with, right? The world becomes a little bit more real to us. It's not in a sense that Jupiter is less real than Saturn, or that Jupiter is more positive than Saturn, or something like that. They both have their version of real, and they both have their version of positive. Jupiter's real is sort of endlessly open and abundant, like a cornucopia. And Jupiter's real is in the surprises of life, in the joy and abundance of life. Saturn says, no, that's actually not joy. That's potentially naivety or ignorance. And when you face limitation, constraint, hardship, etc., when the universe says no to you or makes you realize how hard it is to maintain or have something that you thought was going to be so joyful, those experiences can just, they're sobering in a sense, but there's a lot of magic that appears when we're sober as well. For example, when you're sober, when you're in a sober state of mind, you've been sobered by an experience in life, you become very aware of your own tendencies toward delusional thinking or delusional decision making. For example, when you finally realize, boy, I'm not happy in this relationship, I need to get out of this relationship. It's like suddenly a light went on and I felt sober for the first time, and I realized I'm not happy and I have to get out of this. And yeah, it's sobering, and yeah, it's painful. But then you're like, wow, like I feel like I know myself better now. I'm thinking more clearly. I have more adult maturity, sophistication, right? So Saturn is always offering us the wisdom of pain, loss, maturity, limitation. Similarly, in our youth, we, as James Hillman once said, we curse Saturn, because Saturn represents everything that's basically shutting down all of the possibilities and the youthful exuberance. And so when Saturn comes around, we're like, curse you, Saturn. But as we age, Saturn being the ruler of time and of aging, as we age, we also, it becomes a relief to not have to be everything, to not have to do everything, and to enjoy simpler, fewer things that are more well defined. There was a quote that my father had in like a picture frame when I was little, and it said, do few things, but do them well. And that's such a Saturn quote, right? Maybe a Saturn Venus quote, because he was a pretty artistic guy. But as we age, it becomes a relief to cut off the slack. It's like, okay, let's tighten the ship here a little bit, because I got too much stuff on board. I can't be everything to everyone. I can't do all of the things. But interestingly, it's this negation, it's this negative space that, by means of cutting away at what we can't be, what we don't want, what possibilities won't work, the sobering of those no's that we get, it's like a statue made of ice or wood. And it's slowly, Saturn is the chiseling away that on the surface appears to be the pain of no, or the pain of limit, but is actually over time, with age, with experience and perspective, is the shaping of our unique dharma, our unique essence as a being. And so Saturn limits, but Saturn shapes and defines, right? So we like being shaped and defined. It gives us peace, especially as we get older, because as we age, in some ways, the reality of death and the eventuality of death make the need for fewer things, deeper quality with fewer things. It just makes it a necessity. That's something else Saturn rules, is necessity, because there's very basic reasons. Too many things can get us sick and can kill us the older we get. Too many things can stress our bodies and our minds out, and we become more vulnerable to that as we age. Also, we can become habituated to things in a not so great way as we age, right? The grumpy old man or woman, that's Saturn. But if you've ever met an elder who has been steeped in their essence for a long time, they've let life and the hardships of life shape and define them into a more specific and refined character. Those people we call wise. We call them sages. That's Saturn, actually. Anytime that you're at a party with friends and you're in it, this is great, you're lit, and then all of a sudden you go, I'm done with this. I need to go back. I need to go home. That moment where there's that turn and you're like, this isn't sparkly anymore. Something just isn't doing it for me here. I need to go home and be inward, or I need to let go of this externalizing force. I need to say no to something. Something appears superficial to me, or something as its expiration date has been reached and I'm feeling bored by it. That's Saturn. And so we leave the party and we go home and we sit in an empty living room and we just think like, isn't that strange that just 2 hours ago I was like, this is it. Like, I'm just so lit up by this crowd and this environment and the possibilities and the fun and the scene. And then you get home and you're like, what was I doing? Even if it's another example, I remember when I was a kid, I had this feeling. You have a birthday party, right? You have everybody, your friends, the whole thing. And then there's that moment where it's all over and everybody goes home and you're sitting there with like the remnants of the party, and you're just like, it's kind of depressing. When you're a kid, it's depressing. But I have this weird memory, maybe because I'm a moon and Saturn kind of person. But I have this memory when I was a kid of being very comforted by the empty space after the party, feeling like there was something essentially true about that emptiness, about that negative space, and that there was a lie that was being told. I remember this at a very early age. There was a lie that was being told, and it had something to do with, because I was a preacher's kid, right? So I went to a lot of church events, like all the time. And I just remember thinking, these church events always end in the same way, which is that there's this kind of aftermath where everybody is picking up chairs and it's quiet and empty. And I actually, when I was a really little kid, I remember one of my favorite events, like of all time, was basically this moment when my father, one night, it was very late at night, and he woke me up from my sleep and asked me if I wanted to go out for a walk. And so we went out for a walk under the stars, and we were actually snowshoeing. So it was just heavenly out, and it was really dark and beautiful. So I had these little snowshoes. I grew up in Minnesota. And so we went out for this walk under the stars, and we walked over to the church, which wasn't far. We lived in a parsonage, which means it's like a church-owned house. So we walked over to the church, and we went into the sanctuary at night. and nobody was there, and it was totally dark except for these kind of like, I want to say they're like floor lights, but it wasn't like in a movie theater, but it wasn't like that. It was some other kind of light that was in the sanctuary. It was very dim though. And so the sanctuary was very magical and dark and empty. And something about my father taking me there and just taking me into the sanctuary and walking around with me. And I just remember it being really quiet and feeling like, yeah, I really need this. And I've always been really grateful to my father for that. When I was a teenager, I used to take the keys. This is pretty devious, but I used to take my father's keys at night, and I lived in a remade attic bedroom, and I would climb out the window of my attic, and then I would like move out onto this like awning that covered our front porch and walk, and you could actually go from the awning right to this, like the side of the awning was like a pole, so I could just like slide right down the pole. And then I would grab my bike and I would head to the church in like late at night after my parents were asleep. And I would let myself into the church. And one of the things I did a lot of, like, I did some very naughty preacher kid things, like taking some money from the church, opening the pop machine and taking as much as I wanted. So, but one of the things that I did that still stays with me is I would just go into the sanctuary and I would just sit and I would lay on the floor and I would talk to God sometimes. I would just talk to God, and it felt so good that nobody else was there. Actually wrote a story about this when I was in graduate school called Claiming Sanctuary. You know, when criminals can go to a church, or when refugees or people who are in trouble for some reason or another can go into a church and seek sanctuary. So I wrote a short story about these adventures that I would take to the church during the night, as though they were my own version of claiming sanctuary. That's Saturn. Saturn is the need for the darkness and the emptiness that offers a vital sense of definition to our lives. It's the no, it's the pain, it's the death, it's the reality of maintaining things that we think are going to be easy. And Saturn teaches us to tolerate. This is why Saturn is related to, among other things that are very solid, like trees. In Bhakti, there's a verse from a great prophet in the tradition. And he says, to do bhakti, to learn how to love God, or to learn how to experience the love of God, we have to be humbler than a blade of grass and more tolerant than a tree. And the more tolerant than a tree part is really Saturn, because Saturn is the test of time. And we need that. We need it so badly. For things to be real, we have to endure them. Often enough, the things that we think are real, that give us gratification very quickly, that pass very quickly, are very transient and fleeting. We think we're living for these things, but often we're actually living for more. So we're living for the things that we endure, the things that don't go away, that are hard to live with. And those are actually sometimes better understood as the things that we actually live for. And at least that's Saturn's take. So these are some things to understand about Saturn. And these are the simplest things to start with, that when a Saturn return comes around, Saturn is going to say no to something, or Saturn is going to bring pain. Saturn is going to reduce your options. Saturn is going to make you focus. Saturn is going to bring adult choices, commitments that are defined by how we have to say no to something, and in order to become more specific or refined in some other area. Saturn is the darkness that we need to allow in. Saturn is the willing choice to stick with and tolerate something or someone. So if we're to find love in this lifetime, we have to dare to trust that what we endure over a long period of time can bring us a kind of joy, a kind of depth, and a kind of essential character. Our characters are made through what we endure and through what limits us. The limitations, the endurance, the suffering, those are the things that are like they are the negative space that starts appearing so that the essential thing we are can stand forth more. So a Saturn return is a period in life where there's a new cycle in life starting, a 30-year cycle, basically. And that cycle is starting because you're reaching the threshold of a defining moment, an essentializing moment, an adult moment, a sober moment, a real moment, a limiting moment, a painful moment. Saturn's main message is this or that maybe isn't working, or I'm bored with it, or whatever. And the disillusionment that comes with that is painful, but it also helps us to become more defined or more committed to what we actually are. That's the hope of a Saturn return. On the other hand, the Saturn return can come around and it can be a time at which people start to say, I need to define myself in more concrete ways. So yeah, I'm going to, in a sense, it may not be so focused on saying no to things or the pain and the suffering as much as it is on defining my commitments, defining my values, defining what I will endure for a long time to come. That's why a lot of people get married. That's why a lot of people have some of their first big career accomplishments around Saturn returns. They're things that define, they're things that extend forward with deeper commitment. As they limit us, they shape us. So it's a big rite of passage in terms of maturation, but it's also often a moment of acute awareness about what isn't working. And that can be a personal character flaw or a personal character issue. It can be about relationships. It can be about parents. It can, so many things. The other thing that you can think about in general during a Saturn return is that Saturn returns are often about this need for mastery, to endure with something over a long period of time, to really stick with it is a Saturnine thing. And it's also something that leads to, or it's an intimate part of mastery. How do we master something? So mastery, sometimes that's a part of it. But also we have to be really careful because Saturn is sort of like heard one astrologer put it like this one time, Saturn is the end of the story for everything. It's death, right? So winter. And so to be real with what we're doing, how do you hold something that you're really committed to, something that you really want to define you, when you know that eventually all structures of the ego, all narrative arcs, right? They eventually end in the tragedy, the youthful tragedy of death. It's no coincidence that the sun is exalted in the sign opposite the sign that Saturn is exalted in, Aries and Libra. It's not a mistake that the sun is in its rulership in the sign opposite to Saturn's sign of Aquarius. The sun is also that sense of my narrative, and refines, contains, shapes, structures that narrative. So they have a tight relationship. But the fantasy of the sun, like the fantasy of the ego, is that this will live forever. Saturn is eventually the realization of the Buddha that says, you've made a mistake here. You've made a mistake in thinking that you can live forever, or that this story can bring you ultimate happiness, or that there is something in this world that won't eventually be taken away from you, or that won't eventually die or fall apart, including your own body, including your character, your story. So Saturn is always bringing us that very deep spiritual level of realization. If we walk through a Saturn return, whether we're doing it around 27 to 30 or the end of our 50s, and we're not taking that kind of awareness into what we're doing with a Saturn return, we're not doing ourselves a favor, because Saturn returns are also moments of great profound spiritual maturity, where we can come. One of the ways that we define ourselves when we get closer to our essence or our dharma is to realize we don't have a lot of time here. We don't live forever. Our narratives are not of ultimate importance, right? So if we're squaring up to that, right, we're like, okay, that's a lot. So now I'm faced with, in some ways, the irrelevance of my life and the story that I choose, but also the necessity to choose something because I've got to live a life. Most people think of that as a pressuring situation, a situation where we have to make a choice, and again, we think it's so important that what I choose, I got to get to my essence. I've got to, but actually the blessing of Saturn is to say, your story doesn't matter that much. It's not really what you do, but how you do it. It's not really, another thing that Saturn is going to tell us is that your story is ultimately irrelevant. Irrelevant in the sense that it's not that it lacks meaning, but it's that because everything is meaningful in the material world and because everything dies, it's not of ultimate importance. So your sense of it being of ultimate importance is actually denial of the fact that life is full of a lot of irrelevance. Most people that live on this planet are never remembered again after a couple of generations. Their stories disappear. Very few people that have statues made from them. The families live on and the memories fade. This is just life. It's not a dark thing. It's not a bad thing. And it takes the pressure off from us, which is amazing if you think about it, because Saturn is always talked about as a planet of constraint and restraint and constriction. And that has to be understood in relation to the sun, who's the one trying to figure out, like, what's my destiny? What am I here to do? I've got to do something. I have an essence. I have a dharma, right? Sun. Saturn is the one saying, let's define it. Let's shape it. Let's get, let's master it, right? And all of a sudden, think of the amazing pressure that's taken off from you when Saturn comes along and says, what you choose here is not really, it's not super, super important. You don't put a pressure on yourself to have to be remembered forever, because you won't be, and then, oh, wow, right? That clears us up to be really honest and, in a sense, a lot simpler about what we are and what we can do and what we can't do. It invites us to be tolerant and humble. Then it's not really a restrictive force. Again, it's a character defining force. And defining our character is more important, our essential character, our essential nature, and being true to that. This is why another great Shakespearean moment is that in Hamlet, right? To be or not to be, It's very youthful angst. My life is of the utmost importance, and I have to take up some grand narrative, or should throw it all away. Shakespeare had youth just pinned, right? But actually, and he says, is it better to, take up arms against the sea of troubles? This whole speech in Hamlet, if you've ever read it. And that's so Sun-Saturn. It's the Sun-Saturn battle, which comes up at the Saturn return. Or, to die, to sleep. That's the alternative. So these are both false narratives: depression and ultimate importance, heroism and melancholy. Heroism, my storyline, is of the utmost importance. Depression, I have no meaning. I am somehow, as a being, I am irrelevant. Actually, what Saturn's trying to teach us at the Saturn return is, how can you move into the strength of your character for what it is, not diluted by a dream of ultimate importance, not diluted by the illusion of being an insignificant being. You're a spirit soul. You're eternal. You were never born. You were never dying. You're a part of God. So that's beautiful. And also, that means that getting down to the essential nature of who you are, refining your commitments more, and taking the pressure off from yourself to have to be great, putting the pressure on yourself to be soulful. We each have a dark inner sanctuary that is very soulful. There's a place that we have to steal away to sometimes to find in the negation of the heroic stories that we think are going to define our lives. And Saturn returns are great moments to do that. A lot of the times, Saturn returns are talked about in a very public sense or in a very kind of mundane sense as like, yeah, mastering something, accomplishments, defining your career, like all of this. But they're in that sense, they're tinged with the sun. So yes, those things will be there: the mastery, the commitment, the maturity, the sense of defining your path more, but also the pain, the loss, the agony, the depression, the fear of being insignificant and totally having no meaning in life if you're not a great hero. Those are the treacherous extremes of a Saturn return. Somewhere right in the middle is a deep inner sanctuary calling to us. It's the eventuality of death. It teaches us to live not so much from the perspective of life and its possibilities as much as it teaches us to live from the perspective of death and its eventuality, its necessity. When we take that and we also combine it with Jupiter, which is our hope, our faith, our sense of trust, our sense of possibility, and we can bring them together, then we have something really special, right? So the other maybe secret of a Saturn return is, to how can we see the hope in refining ourselves and becoming more adult in some way, or allowing something that we thought was the answer to fall apart. And if we allow that to fall apart in faith, in hope, in trust, then we're at the moment of a truly unique seeding time. And that's why one of the greatest cycles in ancient astrology that was tracked were the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. These were times that were thought of as the moment of the inception of a truly great new dynasty. We have a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction coming up next year. And so you'll hear me talking about that a lot in 2020. Okay, so I think I said this video was going to be short. Definitely was not. But I hope this meditation on Saturn has been interesting for you. I wanted to talk in part 1, we'll call this again, about the inwardness of Saturn and about the need to live from the perspective of Saturn. We start living from the perspective of Saturn more. We're provided with a moment of real spiritual initiation by Saturn around the end of our 20s and around the end of our 50s. 2 different times. We'll talk about maybe some examples of those experiences more in depth in a future episode. I was thinking maybe I'd show you a chart or 2 in a future episode and teach you some simple tricks for interpreting it in your birth charts. So maybe a couple more episodes to come on Saturn returns. Can't promise when I'll get to them, but I will return to this. Okay, take care, everyone.